NPA Head Sean Abrahams has received recommendations from the prosecution team whether or not to press ahead with the charges of corruption against former President Jacob Zuma. It may take weeks before Zuma knows his fate. The NPA prosecution team took into consideration the former president's representation, which he filed in a bid to stop the prosecution. The Supreme Court of Appeal upheld a High Court ruling that Zuma must face the 18 corruption charges. Well, it's been 9 years since this historic moment. The NPA dropped the charges against then ANC President Jacob Zuma, paving the way for his ascension to the highest office in the land. But nearly a decade later, former President Jacob Zuma's counsel conceded that the decision was irrational, essentially leaving the NPA in the same position it was back in 2009, to prosecute or not to prosecute. The prosecution team was given until today to submit these recommendations to the NPA head. Well, we're now joined in studio by our senior political reporter, that's Aldrin Sampear, who's been tracking these developments very closely. Good afternoon, Aldrin. Always a pleasure to have you on the SABC News Desk.
Thank you.
Aldrin, it's a case that's held the entire nation on tenterhooks for so long now. Those recommendations are just in the nick of time. Take us through the process going forward.
Well, so basically what happens now that Sean Abrahams has received these recommendations from the prosecution's team that he has set up, which also include previous prosecutors who worked on this matter, including the likes of Downer, who back in 2009 already said that President Jacob Zuma must face these charges, even though there was this what we now refer to as the spy tapes. So what happens now is that the head of the NPA will go through these recommendations, but I've been in contact with the spokesperson of the NPA, who's also indicated that Sean Abrahams wants to go a step further, and he wants the entire leadership of the NPA also to be debriefed on these recommendations that have been taken by the team, and this team will obviously brief the entire leadership of the NPA, and only then will a decision be taken whether to prosecute or not to prosecute. You must remember that a decision may have already been taken by the prosecution's team, but the final decision ultimately lies with the NPA head Sean Abrahams whether to continue with the prosecution or not.
What are some of the possible arguments or representations that former President Zuma's team will frame if his day comes in court?
I think because this has been kept under wraps, and understand that the DA has also wanted access to these representations and what arguments President Jacob Zuma has made, but this has been kept under wraps, and of course the NPA is tight-lipped on these representations that have been given by President Jacob Zuma. But one thing that does stand out is that if you remember the SARS Rogue Unit report, it was compiled by a man known as Johan van der Walt. Johan van der Walt, if you go back a couple of years ago, was the person who compiled the KPMG report, which led to the prosecution of President Jacob Zuma's former financial advisor, Sabir Sheikh, and it was that document that was used to press the charges, the 18 charges against President Jacob Zuma, which also detailed the 783 payments, corrupt payments, allegedly that were made to President Jacob Zuma by Sabir Sheikh. And the difficulty with using that argument is that, remember that the KPMG report, the SARS Rogue Unit KPMG report, has now been discredited. KPMG has now pulled it back. The argument that President Jacob Zuma could have made is that, considering that this person has now been discredited, how do you use a report that he's compiled to press these charges against me and continue with the prosecution? My difficulty with it, though, is that this report has already been accepted by the High Court. Remember that it was Judge Squires who found Sabir Sheikh guilty of corruption. So that document has already been submitted into court, and it has been upheld all the way through to the Constitutional Court in Sabir Sheikh trying to overturn that prosecution. So it will be very difficult for President Jacob Zuma to argue why this report should not be used. Also, perhaps take into consideration that this man may have been discredited, but this document was used in a court of law and led to the successful corruption conviction of Sabir Sheikh.
All right, we have another seminal week ahead of us. The Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution case going to Court on Wednesday. Just put it all into context for us. Give us the background of that case and some of the implications. How do you think it will play out? Come Madhubik.
This is based on the ruling by the High Court. I think it was the High Court in, was it December, if I'm not mistaken, which found that there must be a vacancy declared in the NDPP, the position of the NDPP, which set aside the appointment of Sean Abrahams and essentially tried to reinstate the appointment of Nxasane, the former NDPP head. However, though, what the court found there was that although Nxasane should have remained in that position, considering that he took that golden handshake, 17 million rand, he cannot be considered to be reinstated. So the difficulty that now stands is that what Kasek is trying to argue in the Constitutional Court is that there must be a vacancy declared in the office of the NDPP, and the NDPP now has a very important decision to take, which is whether to prosecute a former President Jacob Zuma or not, and they believe that it should be someone else who makes that decision whether to prosecute or not. It shouldn't be Sean Abrahams.
Thank you, Aldrin Sampear, senior political reporter, bringing us up to speed on the potential Zuma prosecution case. Let's move on now.